Martial arts theme music is varied. There are great classical pieces inspired by battles, duels and fighting in general that were used for operas, musicals, television and movies. For that matter, musical instruments have a strong relationship and well-known historical connection with martial arts. There's a specific genre of music performed by professional soldiers that is sometimes called martial music. Independently, the different instruments could serve important tactical purposes, from intimidating the enemy or to communicate to troops. Perhaps the most universal of combat instruments are the drums that keep a marching army on the move. Other instruments have included whistles, fifes, bugles, trumpets, or other horns often used as signals or a primitive form of pre-radio information broadcasting. Then there are triangles and cymbals that usually make up martial music bands. From the last Jacobite Rising of 1745 and 46 to the fining of David Brooks in 1996, the Scottish bagpipes were declared an instrument of war in UK law. Today they're regarded as only an instrument of war in wartime. Highland regiments famously enter the battlefield with an appointed pipe player. Meanwhile, Muay Thai fights are always accompanied by music played on the distinctive reed Pai Kayak or Pai Java, the Javanese clarinet. The Klong Klak, a set of true drums, Ching, a set of brass or iron cymbals, and the Kong Moon. Specific sets are arranged for the pre-fight Wai Kru bows to teachers and Ram Moi ritual dances, as well as the rounds of the fight. Having a strong dance element, capoeira is always practiced to the orchestral sounds produced by players of the barembu, pandeiro, atabaque and agogo. When it comes to musicians, they have arguably a worse record than writers, poets, artists and actors combined for brawling. I am not sure if it is the nature of music, the particular intensity of musical careers, the iconic status of musicians, or combinations of any of the above, but throughout history into the present day, musicians have not been shy about getting physical. Indeed, violence across musical genres has got as extreme as it can get, short of kicking off an actual war. From hip-hop to hardcore, and from extreme metalers to Leadbelly, there has been no shortage of musical artists who have violently murdered people or been violently murdered themselves. Let's be clear, fighting and violence are natural instincts in all animals. By definition, they are not automatically expressions we can call martial arts. Those who fight regularly may or may not have an interest in martial arts. J.J. Burnell, the bass player and regular lead vocalist of punk band The Stranglers, is a case in point. Throughout the pioneering and heyday of the British punk scene, The Stranglers were often at the centre of violent confrontations. Johnny Rotten might have called them short-haired hippies, but there wasn't a lot of peace when J.J. Burnell got annoyed. He took no prisoners. That included sounds journalist and punk rock historical documenter John Savage, who Burnell tracked down to the Red Cow in Hammersmith, London. Savage had written a bad review of the Stranglers' second studio album, No More Heroes, and for that, Burnell, quote-unquote, punched his lights out. A year previously, Burnell had taken on the Clash's bass player and fashion icon Paul Simonon. According to Burnell, the Stranglers were supporting the Ramones at Dingwalls in Camden, London, and had just walked off stage when Simonon spat on the ground. Spitting or gobbing was a trademark strongly associated with punks, despite the likes of Mick Jagger already breaking this taboo in the previous decade. Johnny Rotten of the Sex Pistols attributed his spitting to a severe sinus problem, which he said provoked an annoying habit in audiences who then spat at him as a weird form of affection. Simonon, however, apparently did it as a nervous tic. Anyway, the act got him a punch from Burnell. According to Burnell, after being thrown out by the bouncers, he and Simonon were nose to nose in the car park, with his bandmates on one side and the Sex Pistols, the Ramones and the Clash on the other. He also said that the Stranglers' most peaceful short-haired hippie, keyboardist Dave Greenfield, had Johnny Rotten up against the band's ice cream van, their makeshift touring bus at the time. Well, all of that might seem like so much thuggery. None of it can be described as examples of martial arts, and certainly not justifiable as self-defence. Although violence was frequently associated with punk, martial arts weren't an obvious fit. The prevailing view and outward appearance of martial arts was that of discipline. Discipline meant order, and early punk was about chaos. Forget boxing too. Folk rock legends Simon and Garfunkel had probably put their mark on this in 1970 with their allegorical song The Boxer. 1976 was the year punk caught everyone's attention, and it was also the same year Rocky came out. The overwhelming message of the American dream wasn't exactly in line with the nihilistic vibe of first-generation punks. The Clash's drummer, Topper Headon, might have enjoyed displaying his love for Bruce Lee by posing with a pair of nunchaku, kicking a sandbag and wearing a Yellow Game of Death tracksuit, but he was an anomaly. Likewise, punk poet John Cooper Clarke's Kung Fu International comes over as a mildly racist limerick that sits awkwardly amongst Tony Wilson's compilation of legendary punk rock performances. Outside such rare examples as these, interest in Asian martial arts had already been publicly embraced by representatives and icons of other musical genres. Despite their obvious influences in both music and fashion, 70s punks were keen to distance themselves from virtually all other musical or youth movements. The king of rock and roll, Elvis Presley's martial arts journey began the same year as Chuck Norris in 1958. It was also the same year they both enlisted in the US military. However, whereas Norris began with judo before he discovered his love for Tang Soo Do at his station in South Korea, Presley was stationed in Germany and learned Shotokan karate from Jürgen Seidel. During his annual leave in Paris, he trained under Tetsujiro Murakami, an early representative of Shotokan in Europe, who would eventually train under Shiroguru Igami and convert to his Shotokai school. In 1960, Elvis met the enigmatic martial arts pioneer Ed Parker, the father of American Kempo karate. Although bearing the name and many of the outward trappings of karate, Parker's system was very much a hybrid fusion. At the time he trained Presley, the Chinese influence on the art, which had come from William Chow, was very evident, but Parker would further rework his syllabus to address modern American self-defense situations. Parker sent Presley to Henry Hank Slomansky to test for his karate black belt. Slomansky had earned his Godan, 4th degree black belt, in Chitteroo, in Japan, where he also had apparently won an international karate tournament. He would also be awarded 3 Purple Hearts and eventually finished his military career at the rank of Command Sergeant Major. The story is that he trained and tested his students hard, trying to break them so that their grades were well earned. There were already stories beginning to circulate in the 1950s that celebrities were getting their black belts too easily. In reaction to this, Slomansky apparently put Presley through a rigorous 6-week training program before reporting back to Ed Parker with the words, quote, "Your boy ain't pretty anymore, but he's a black belt," end quote. Shotokan karate is a very different school to even the earliest type of Kenpo karate Ed Parker would have learned, and there was decades worth of stylistic divergences from Chitteroo. I'm not quite sure what Presley's black belt qualification represented or how he was tested after a total of 2 years learning. Elvis Presley continued to train with Ed Parker through the 60s and until his death in 1977. In 1970, he was recommended to train with Kang Rhee, who taught his own hybrid system, Pasaru, generally his synthesis of Korean martial arts derived from Japanese and Okinawan martial arts such as Kong Soo Do and Hapkido. 4 years later, the king of rock and roll was a 7th Dan under Rhee, who named him Mr. Tiger after it was decided that calling him Mr. Panther might carry political connotations. According to Wayne Carman, the author of Elvis's Karate Legacy and the student who first introduced Presley to Rhee, the king had an affinity for the number 7. In order to attain this grade, Rhee had to be voted the rank of 8th Dan, and Presley bought him a Cadillac to say thank you. Perhaps it's testament to Presley's status as a musical icon that comparatively few people remember his clear passion for martial arts. Yet he put martial arts routines into his stage shows, often turning them into some of his trademark poses, and they're in some of his movie fight scenes. He even wore a tailored gi complete with flares. Perhaps Presley's biggest attempt to promote his martial arts in the mainstream is the unreleased documentary he made with Rhee and Carman, The New Gladiator. The film shows Presley demonstrating various trick feats, teaching and joking in a martial arts class. The footage even features him talking to Bill Superfoot Wallace as Wallace receives his 4th Dan. Wallace's core karate school was the Shorin-ryu discipline, so I'm not quite sure what his 4th Dan represented either. One of Presley's favourite martial arts demonstrations was disarming people holding real loaded guns. The story of Presley instructing a young Alice Cooper to hold a .32 snub-nosed revolver to his forehead before taking the shock rocker to the ground has become one of Cooper's regular anecdotes. Presley's image, certainly during the 70s phase, was not going to be a good fit for the first generation of punks. In fact, the sudden death of Elvis Presley in 1977 forms part of the 1980 punk rockumentary DOA A Rite of Passage, somewhat symbolising the death of rock and roll in the wake of this new irreverent and antagonistic movement. At least Elvis once represented the sort of youth rebellion that used to upset the establishment. The same year he had been graded his 7th Dan and began shooting the new Gladiator. It had been 1 year since Bruce Lee had died and the kung fu boom had exploded. Carl Douglas had more than claimed mainstream disco's share with his novelty smash hit Kung Fu Fighting, and the squeaky pop clean star brothers the Osmond put on a full Tang Soo Do demonstration choreographed by Chuck Norris for a BBC special. To come to think of it, John Cooper Clarke's final line of Kung Fu International might be reinterpreted as the official anarchic punk sentiment to the martial arts craze of their decade. Quote, "Enter the dragon, exit Johnny Clarke." End quote. That would seem the case, except for the fact that punk's most prominent and successful scrapper, not to mention one of the first generation's most distinctive bass players, had been practicing martial arts since he was 19. J.J. Burnell started with Taekwondo and switched to Kyokushin Karate when he was 21. The band's trailblazing success on the Japanese alternative and burgeoning punk scene provided a great opportunity for Burnell to train at the Kyokushin Kaikan in Ikebukuro, which he did in 1978. This also happened to be the same year knockdown champion Yoshiji Soeno broke away from traditional Kyokushin to found Shidokin Karate. This became the school of karate that Burnell taught, becoming the UK's chief instructor in 1991. There's no secret about Burnell's love and dedication for his martial art. There's plenty of footage of him competing in the full contact competitions in Shoryuken Karate, and also him teaching right up to the present day. In 2014, he achieved his 7th Dan. Whilst punk's provocativeness quickly became assimilated into the mainstream at the end of the 70s, another street-level movement fighting for a harder-pressed underclass had been evolving in the Bronx, New York. Hip-hop was set to burst onto the scene at the dawn of the 80s. Tied to environments where crime and police brutality were a regular everyday occurrence, hip-hop artists certainly understood violence. The music genre rapidly mutated, diversified, and divided into rival factions. 1992 saw a highly influential group emerge from the East Coast side of the great hip-hop divide. The Wu-Tang Clan proudly wore their love for martial arts movies in their title, as well as the titles of several of their songs and albums. But this was no novelty outfit. Martial art references taken from the 70s kung fu boom were used as metaphors and allegories as they produced various songs about life in poverty on the streets in Staten Island, which they call Shaolin Land. To this day, the group are respected in the hip-hop industry for their artistry and for being able to appeal to both underground and mainstream audiences. From their debut album, Enter the Wu-Tang 36 Chambers, where two 70s martial arts movie classics are combined in the title, to their most recent original studio album, Once Upon a Time in Shaolin Land, the group don't seem to have forgotten their love of all things kung fu.